In the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling granting Donald Trump sweeping presidential immunity, Trump has now issued a motion requesting that Judge Merchan in New York not only vacate his 34 felony convictions, but to dismiss his New York indictment altogether. Trump's goal here is to use the Supreme Court's ruling to reverse engineer his exoneration and fool himself and his supporters into believing that he was never actually indicted in the first place. Now, let's be clear, this isn't Judge Cannon we're talking about. So just because Trump is attempting to yet again subvert the legal process absolutely does not mean that he'll be successful. Remember, the ruling from the Supreme Court offers a president vast immunity, but the Manhattan case focuses on acts that Trump took as a candidate. He was literally running to become president. He falsified business records to hide an affair he had with Stormy Daniels to help himself in the upcoming presidential election, meaning that he was at that time a private citizen. So this Supreme Court ruling shouldn't apply. With that said, Trump's team will argue that prosecutors built their case using evidence from his time as president, like reimbursement checks that Trump signed from the White House. So they'll argue that anything that happens in the White House is an official act. But let's be clear, that would be utter bullshit. Just because you do something while you're president doesn't immediately make it official conduct. And I hate to break it to all those strict constitutionalists out there, but writing reimbursement checks for sleeping with a porn star is not, in any way, shape, or form, official conduct. With that said, while this new Supreme Court ruling absolutely shouldn't apply to Trump, let's not pretend that we haven't already seen the legal system twist itself into pretzels to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, even and especially when he doesn't deserve it. Again, the one thing that we have going for the rule of law is that Judge Merchan, unlike Judge Aileen Cannon in Florida, is not a Trump lackey. He is a fair judge who ran a fair trial. But we have watched the Trump team avail itself over and over of the appeals process, only to eventually find a court or a judge willing to do his bidding. In this instance, it may certainly be possible for Trump to appeal any decision all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And yes, this is a state trial, but Trump could seek to have this case jump from the state court system to the federal court system, and the final arbiters of the law in the federal court system are the same Supreme Court justices who just created out of whole cloth this brand new doctrine suggesting that presidents are above the law. So while this should be an open and shut decision in New York, recent history has taught us not to be naive about what could happen. But I do have to note that this is a Supreme Court whose job is purportedly to interpret the Constitution, and yet they decided to invent an entirely new provision of what the Constitution actually says. I mean, think about it. These people parade themselves around as textualists and originalists, and yet they decided that a Constitution that said quite literally nothing about presidential immunity for criminal activity somehow existed. To be clear, it doesn't. In fact, the Constitution does offer civil immunity for legislators through what's called the Speech and Debate Clause. So the fact that the framers put that in the Constitution and yet chose not to put anything about criminal immunity for presidents shows us by negative inference that the decision not to offer presidents unlimited power was deliberate. This Supreme Court then overturned that 200-year precedent, all out of blind deference to a convicted felon at whose feet they grovel, all the while beating their chests as originalists. In fact, need more proof that any claims this Supreme Court has to textualism or originalism are completely baseless? Consider Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. There, the plain text of the Constitution says that no officeholder who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection against the same. Doesn't get clearer than that. Donald Trump incited an insurrection. He is automatically disqualified from holding office again. Period. And yet, somehow, that was too ambiguous for this court. This court will ignore the obvious words of the Constitution in blind deference to their God King, all the while concocting entirely new provisions to shield him. They do not serve the Constitution, they serve Donald Trump. So at this point, Judge Merchan will consider Trump's request to vacate all 34 felony convictions, which frankly he was doing anyway. You'll remember that he was already delaying sentencing, which was supposed to be on July 11th, so that will take place in September now, as he weighs whether or not the Supreme Court's immunity ruling has any bearing on this case. So because Merchan was already considering this question, nothing changes other than the blatant efforts to evade accountability by Donald Trump. And while the Supreme Court might be willing to violate their oaths of office for Trump, Judge Merchan isn't likely to do the same. I've got a really exciting announcement. I've written a book. It's called Shameless. This book explores how Republicans have exploited their historical branding while attacking our democracy, how the media has proven itself a willful participant, and how Democrats can learn from this to rebalance the political scales and save our democracy. It has been a lifelong dream of mine to write my own book, and so I'd like to ask you to pre-order it by clicking the link right here on the screen. And if you buy within this pre-order period, your book is going to come with a signed nameplate. As you know, I've never had a single sponsor on my channel. I don't ask for money or anything like that, but if you're looking for a way to support me, this is hands down the best way to do it. So again, follow the link right here on the screen, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for pre-ordering Shameless. And as always, make sure to subscribe to see more of my content.